I was standing in the freezing December air, my fingers numb around a cardboard box filled with donated toys, when the HOA president walked straight toward me and said 5 words that made my stomach drop. "This event is canceled. Right now." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. The words didn't match the scene around us. Christmas lights were half-strung across folding tables. A volunteer was dragging a speaker toward the outlet, and a little kid behind me was tugging on his mom's sleeve asking when Santa was coming. Nothing about this moment felt illegal. And yet there she was, standing like a judge delivering a sentence. I looked around as if someone might laugh and say this was a joke, but no one did. Cars were pulling up one by one, trunks popping open as families unloaded bags of toys and coats. Steam rose from cups of hot chocolate in the cold air. A volunteer waved at me from across the parking area, smiling, completely unaware that the woman standing 3 feet from me had just tried to kill the entire event with a single sentence. My heart started pounding, not just from anger, but from pure disbelief. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't pull me aside. She wanted an audience. With her arms crossed and her HOA badge clipped proudly to her coat, she announced that the event was unauthorized and therefore illegal. The way she said it made it sound like I'd been caught dumping trash instead of organizing a charity drive. I felt my face heat up as people nearby slowed down, pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. I asked her what she was talking about, trying to keep my voice steady. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. Weeks of planning flashed through my head. The flyers, the emails, the phone calls, the city paperwork. I had followed every step because I knew how HOAs worked. I knew they looked for reasons to shut things down. That's why her confidence rattled me. She spoke like someone who knew she had the power to ruin this, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. She took a step closer and told me I was violating HOA rules, that I was exposing the community to liability, and that if I didn't shut it down immediately, fines would start piling up by the hour. Her voice was calm, almost smug, like she'd rehearsed this moment. Around us, neighbors started forming a loose circle. I could feel eyes on my back. Whispers followed. Some people looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked angry on my behalf. That's when the anger finally broke through the shock. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't cut corners or ignored the rules. I had done everything the right way, even when it was a pain. I wanted to tell her that, to pull out my phone and shove the proof in her face, but something told me to slow down. This wasn't just about paperwork. This was about control. She ended the conversation with a threat. If I didn't shut the event down immediately, she would call the police, issue fines, and have vehicles towed. As she said it, a white city vehicle turned onto the street and rolled slowly toward us. My eyes locked onto it, and my heart skipped. In that moment, I realized this confrontation was only just beginning. What made it worse was knowing this wasn't just some party they were trying to shut down. This wasn't music or decorations or a few tables in a parking lot. This was something I had built with a purpose, something rooted in my own past, meant for families who were quietly struggling and hoping for even a small bit of relief during the hardest time of the year. Standing there after her threat, I felt a tight pressure in my chest because I knew exactly what canceling this event would mean to people who would never show up to complain. I grew up in a house where Christmas was unpredictable. Some years were good. Other years my parents did their best to hide how tight things were, but kids always know. I remember one winter when the tree stayed empty until Christmas Eve night, and even then, the gifts were small, carefully chosen, and stretched as far as possible. I never forgot how much those moments mattered, not because of what I got, but because someone tried. That memory followed me into adulthood, especially once I owned a home and finally felt like I had something stable to give back. That's where this charity event came from. It wasn't an idea I pulled out of nowhere. It was something I'd been thinking about for years, waiting for the right time and the right place. When I moved into this neighborhood, I saw families just like mine growing up. Good people, hardworking people, People who didn't ask for help, even when they needed it. I figured if we could collect toys, coats, and food, even for a handful of families, it would be worth every ounce of effort. What surprised me was how quickly the community got behind it. Neighbors I barely knew stopped me on evening walks asking how they could help. Local parents offered to volunteer. Someone donated hot chocolate supplies. Another neighbor offered to dress up as Santa. The support felt genuine, organic, and generous. For the first time in a while, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of just a collection of houses with matching fences. That generosity made the HOA president's hostility feel even colder. While people were offering time and money, she was sending curt messages, asking questions that felt more like accusations. She wanted to know who authorized the event, who would be responsible if someone slipped, who would control the crowd. At first, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I assumed she was just doing her job, but the tone never softened. If anything, it got sharper. The emotional importance of the event kept pushing me forward. Every box of donated toys reminded me why I started. Every volunteer who showed up early reminded me this wasn't about ego or attention. It was about giving families something warm to hold on to during a season that can feel brutally lonely if you're struggling. That's why her behavior hurt more than I expected. It felt like she wasn't just blocking an event, she was blocking compassion. Looking back, the signs were there. She never once asked how the event would help the community. She never offered solutions, only obstacles. And then, late one evening, my phone buzzed with an email notification that made my stomach sink. The subject line was formal and cold, questioning my right to host the event at all. As I opened it, I realized this fight was about to turn official. The more I read her emails, the more I realized something was off. The language was confident, almost aggressive, but the rules she kept citing didn't sound familiar at all. I read them once, then again, scrolling slowly as if I might recognize something I'd missed before. Phrases like unauthorized gathering, improper use of common space, and unapproved solicitation were thrown around like they were ironclad laws, yet I couldn't remember ever seeing them in any HOA document. It felt less like enforcement and more like improvisation. Each new message carried a heavier threat. She warned me about daily fines that could stack up quickly. She mentioned violations that could affect my standing in the community. At one point, she even hinted that continued defiance could lead to further action, without explaining what that meant. The vagueness was unsettling. It was the kind of language meant to scare, not inform, and it worked, at least for a moment. I'd never been on the wrong side of the HOA before, and I could feel that familiar anxiety creeping in, the fear that they always seemed to count on. Still, something didn't sit right. I kept thinking about how suddenly all of this had escalated. Just weeks earlier, the idea of the event had barely registered with her. Now it was being treated like a major violation. That's when I decided to stop reacting emotionally and start digging. If she was going to use the rules as a weapon, I needed to know exactly what those rules said. Late that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, surrounded by printed documents and old HOA emails. I pulled up the bylaws, the CC&Rs, meeting minutes from past years, anything I could find. At first, it was overwhelming. Legal language has a way of blurring together when you're tired and frustrated. But the more I read, the clearer things became. Those specific rules she was citing weren't there. Not in the bylaws, not in the community guidelines, not even buried in old amendments. That realization hit me harder than the threats. It wasn't relief, it was suspicion. I kept searching, convinced I must have missed something. Eventually, I found references to how new rules were supposed to be adopted. Notices, board votes, recorded minutes, homeowner communication. None of that had happened. There was no paper trail, no vote, no announcement, just her emails, delivered with absolute certainty, as if saying something confidently enough could make it real. I leaned back in my chair and felt the confusion turn into something colder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an overcautious HOA president worried about liability. This felt deliberate. It felt like power being used simply because it could be used. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces lined up. The public confrontation, the threats, the sudden appearance of rules no one else had ever heard of. It wasn't about safety or procedure. It was about control. What unsettled me most was realizing how easily this could work on someone else. If I hadn't taken the time to look things up, I might have backed down, assuming I was in the wrong. That thought made my jaw tighten. I wasn't just defending an event anymore. I was staring straight at the possibility that the HOA president was abusing her position, counting on fear and ignorance to get her way. And once that thought took hold, I knew this situation was far bigger than I'd originally believed. That's when I looked down at my phone and realized something she didn't want me to understand. I already had city approval. In the middle of all her threats and confident warnings, I had almost forgotten the one thing that mattered most. Weeks before any of this started, before the emails, before the confrontations, I had gone straight to the city and done everything by the book. Not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted this event to be untouchable. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table filling out the permit application, double-checking every line. Location, date, time, noise limits, traffic flow. I even included a simple site map showing where tables and donation bins would go. When the confirmation email came back approved, I felt relieved. It wasn't just a green light, it was protection. The city had reviewed the event, asked their questions, and signed off on it. In my mind, that was the end of the story. Standing there now, with my phone in my hand, I scrolled back through that email. The approval was clear. The permit number was listed. The conditions were spelled out. There was no ambiguity, no pending status, no room for interpretation. This wasn't some casual agreement. It was official. And for the first time since the HOA president had started pushing back, I felt the fear loosen its grip. What really changed everything was understanding the difference between what she claimed to control and what she actually did. The city permit covered the public area we were using, the same space where community events had happened before. The HOA had authority over certain internal matters, but they weren't above city law. No matter how confident she sounded, she couldn't just erase a city-issued permit because it didn't suit her. When I mentioned the permits to her, expecting at least a pause, she didn't even flinch. She brushed them off like they were meaningless, telling me the HOA had final say regardless of what the city approved. The way she said it was unsettling, like she truly believed it. Or worse, like she was hoping I would believe it. For a moment, that old doubt tried to creep back in. HOAs have a way of making you question what you know. Instead of arguing, I did something different. I stepped away and called the number listed at the bottom of the permit email. A real person answered. I explained the situation calmly, laying out what was happening and what the HOA president was threatening to do. There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to make my heart race again. Then the city official spoke, firm and clear. She told me the permit was valid. She confirmed that the city had jurisdiction over the space and that the HOA could not override their approval. Hearing that out loud felt like oxygen rushing back into my lungs. The fear that had been sitting in my chest since the first confrontation finally started to fade, replaced by something steadier. Confidence. Not loud confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that comes from knowing you're standing on solid ground. Before hanging up, the city official gave me one final piece of advice. She told me to document everything. Every email, every threat, every attempt by the HOA to interfere. Her tone shifted slightly when she said it, serious in a way that made my stomach tighten again. As I ended the call, I realized this wasn't just about getting permission anymore. This was about preparing for what the HOA president might do next. She didn't just want to stop the event. She wanted to humiliate me in front of my own neighbors. That became clear the moment she raised her voice instead of pulling me aside. This wasn't a private discussion about rules or procedures. This was a performance. She stood in the open, shoulders squared, speaking loudly enough that anyone within 50 feet could hear her, and she made sure her words carried. Every sentence felt designed to put me on trial in the court of public opinion. She started listing violations like she was reading charges from a script. Unauthorized use, liability concerns, community disruption. Each phrase was delivered slowly, confidently, with little pauses that let the words sink in. People stopped what they were doing. Volunteers froze mid-unload. A couple of neighbors leaned against their cars, pretending not to stare while clearly listening to every word. I could feel the attention pressing in on me from all sides, and for a split second, I understood exactly why tactics like this work. Inside, my emotions were a mess. Anger surged first, hot and immediate. Then embarrassment followed, sharp and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and I had to consciously slow my breathing so my voice wouldn't betray how hard this was hitting me. I reminded myself of the permits, the bylaws, the city officials' words. Losing control here would only give her what she wanted. So I stayed calm. I kept my hands at my sides. I spoke evenly, asking her to lower her voice and reminding her that we could discuss this privately. That seemed to irritate her even more. The calmer I was, the louder she became, as if my refusal to react emotionally was an insult. She cut me off repeatedly, correcting me in front of everyone, framing herself as the responsible authority and me as the reckless homeowner who needed to be reined in. The neighbors' reactions were hard to watch. Some looked away, clearly uncomfortable, not wanting to get involved. Others watched with wide eyes, unsure of who to believe. I caught the expression of one volunteer who had been so excited about helping, confusion mixed with worry, like she was wondering if she'd made a mistake coming. That hurt more than the accusations. This event was supposed to bring people together, and instead it was turning into a public standoff. For a moment, I felt completely alone, even though I knew I was in the right. Standing there under her scrutiny made me feel isolated, like the ground beneath me could shift at any second. That feeling passed quickly, replaced by something firmer. Resolve. I realized she was counting on intimidation to end this without resistance. She wanted me to fold, apologize, and quietly shut everything down so she could walk away victorious. Instead, I repeated myself calmly. I told her I had followed the law. I told her I had city approval. I told her I was willing to cooperate, but I wasn't going to cancel the event based on threats. That's when her tone changed. The calm authority cracked just enough to reveal frustration underneath. She leaned in and told me that if I didn't comply immediately, she would start issuing daily fines. She said vehicles could be towed without further notice. She said she was prepared to escalate this as far as necessary. The words hung in the cold air, heavy and deliberate. As she finished speaking, I realized this confrontation was about to cross a line that neither of us could step back from. The moment a board member pulled me aside and whispered, "This isn't about safety," everything clicked. It happened quietly, almost secretly, like he was afraid of being seen talking to me. While the HOA president was busy asserting her authority a few yards away, he leaned in just enough to speak without drawing attention. His voice was low, tense, and nothing like the confident tone she used. That contrast alone told me more than his words did. He didn't stay long. He couldn't. But in those few seconds, he said enough to crack the whole situation open. He told me this wasn't the first time she had done something like this, that she had a habit of using rules when she didn't like something, then finding a way to justify it later. He didn't call it corruption outright, but the implication hung there between us. When I asked him why she cared so much about this event, he just shook his head and said, "She hates not being in control." As I stood there watching her continue to lecture volunteers, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. This wasn't about liability or community safety. It was about authority. About being the one who decides what happens and what doesn't. The idea that a group of homeowners had organized something meaningful without her approval clearly bothered her. That realization hurt more than I expected. I had always assumed HOA leadership, even when annoying, was at least acting in good faith. The more I thought about it, the more examples surfaced. Past events she had supported without question. Small gatherings hosted by her friends that never seemed to need permits or approvals. Decorations that bent the rules but were ignored because the right people were involved. I started seeing a pattern that I hadn't wanted to acknowledge before. Rules weren't rules when they benefited her. They only mattered when they could be used against someone else. That sense of betrayal settled deep in my chest. I lived here. I paid dues like everyone else. I followed the process. To realize that leadership might be using their position selectively felt like a personal violation, not just an administrative problem. It changed how I viewed every email she'd sent and every accusation she'd made. What I had initially taken as overcaution now looked a lot like manipulation. Instead of confronting her again, I made a different decision. I went home and started gathering proof. I pulled old newsletters, archived emails, community calendars, and meeting minutes. I searched for records of similar events, approvals that never seemed to exist on paper. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. There were gaps, missing votes, selective enforcement, patterns that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. What unsettled me most was how confident she had been while standing on such shaky ground. She spoke with absolute authority, but the foundation underneath her claims was thin, maybe non-existent. That meant one of two things. She either didn't know the truth, or she was counting on me not knowing it. Neither option sat well with me. Late that night, as I scrolled through old board documents, I found something that made my heart start pounding again. A record that directly contradicted her claims about unauthorized events. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I reread it, realizing this wasn't just evidence of hypocrisy. It was proof that she had been lying. And once I understood that, I knew the fight was about to change completely. I barely slept the night before the event, knowing I'd wake up to either a community celebration or a legal nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the threats in my head. Fines, police, towing. I kept reaching for my phone, half expecting another email to come through telling me it was all over. When my alarm finally went off, it felt like I'd never really fallen asleep at all. The morning air was bitter cold when I arrived at the site just after sunrise. Frost clung to the grass and the pavement, crunching under my boots as I started unloading tables. The sky was still gray, that quiet hour before the neighborhood wakes up. For a moment, everything felt calm. Peaceful even. I tried to let myself believe that maybe the worst was behind me. Volunteers began showing up one by one, cheerful and energized, bundled in coats and scarves. They smiled, waved, asked where to put things. None of them knew what had been happening behind the scenes. None of them knew how close this whole thing was to being shut down. Watching them work, laughing as they struggled with tangled lights and heavy boxes, made my chest tighten. These people showed up because they cared, not because they had to. The thought of telling them to pack up and leave felt unbearable. As we were setting up the donation bins, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I knew before I even looked that it wasn't good news. The message was short and formal, stamped with HOA letterhead. A cease and desist notice. It ordered me to immediately halt all activity related to the event, citing the same vague violations I'd already disproven. Reading it there, in the cold, surrounded by people who believed this was going to be a good day, felt like being punched in the gut. I stepped away from the group and stood near my car, staring at the screen. This was the moment she had been pushing me toward. Cancel now and avoid conflict, or stand firm and risk escalation. I thought about the families who would show up later, kids who didn't know anything about HOA politics or permits. I thought about how excited everyone had been to help. Canceling would be easy. Standing my ground would not. Fear crept in, quiet but persistent. What if she followed through? What if police showed up and shut us down anyway? What if this turned into something that dragged on for months? But beneath that fear was something stronger. A sense of responsibility. I'd started this. I had promised people this would happen, and I had done everything the right way. I took a deep breath and put the phone back in my pocket. I walked back toward the volunteers and kept working. Every table I unfolded, every string of lights I hung, felt like a decision being made. Not out loud, but inside. I wasn't going to cancel based on intimidation. About 20 minutes later, the sound of an engine pulled my attention toward the street. A large truck rolled slowly into view and stopped near the entrance. My stomach dropped when I saw the logo on the door. A towing company. And just behind it, stepping out of her car with the same confident posture as before, was the HOA president. As she walked toward us, I realized this morning was about to turn into a direct confrontation I could no longer avoid. She tried to shut us down while children were standing there holding toys. That's the image that's burned into my memory more than anything else. Kids clutching stuffed animals, parents smiling nervously, volunteers handing out hot chocolate, and her voice cutting through it all like a siren. She walked straight into the middle of the setup area as if she owned it, not even slowing down when she saw who was watching. She didn't lower her voice this time. In fact, she raised it. She announced that everyone needed to stop what they were doing and leave the area immediately. She said the event was not permitted, that it was in violation of HOA rules, and that anyone who stayed was doing so at their own risk. The words felt rehearsed, delivered with that same stiff confidence, like she expected obedience the moment she spoke. I stepped forward before anyone else could react. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. I told her calmly that the event was permitted, that we had city approval, and that no one was breaking the law. I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I pulled out my phone and opened the permit email. I held it where she could see it, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to make the point that I wasn't bluffing. She barely glanced at it. Instead, she snapped back that HOA rules superseded city permits and that I was misleading residents. That was the moment my frustration turned into something sharper. Anger, yes, but also moral outrage. This wasn't just about me anymore. She was standing there, in front of families and children, trying to use fear and authority to shut down a charity event. Watching a little boy squeeze his toy tighter while his mom looked back and forth between us made my chest ache. I reminded her again that I had spoken directly with the city. I told her the permits were valid and that if she disagreed, she was welcome to contact the city herself. She scoffed, waved her hand dismissively, and told volunteers they should leave before fines and towing began. The towing truck idled behind her, a silent threat. That image, charity banners fluttering in the cold wind next to a tow truck, felt surreal. Some parents shifted uncomfortably. A volunteer asked quietly if they should stop. I shook my head, trying to project confidence I didn't fully feel yet. I told everyone we were legally allowed to be there. Saying it out loud felt risky, but it also felt necessary. If I wavered, this would be over. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice just enough to make it personal. She warned me that I was making a mistake, that this could get very expensive for me, that I should think carefully about how far I wanted to push this. For a brief moment, fear flared again. HOAs are good at that. They rely on it. But then I looked past her and saw the families waiting patiently, unsure whether to stay or go. I stood my ground. I told her I wasn't canceling the event and that any further action on her part would need to go through the city. The tension was thick enough to feel in the air. That's when I heard sirens in the distance. Not loud yet, but unmistakable. She turned her head slightly, just enough to reveal a flicker of uncertainty. A few seconds later, a city vehicle pulled into view, followed closely by a police car. And suddenly the balance of power was about to be tested in front of everyone. The second the city official spoke, every fake rule she invented collapsed. It didn't happen loudly or dramatically. There was no shouting, no spectacle. Just a calm, authoritative voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The city official stepped out of the vehicle, clipboard in hand, and asked a simple question. Who was in charge of the event? When I raised my hand, my heart was pounding, but for the first time that morning, it wasn't fear driving it. I explained the situation slowly, sticking to facts. I told her about the permits, the approvals, and the threats to shut the event down. I handed over my phone and showed her the documentation. She barely needed a minute. She scanned the permit, nodded once, and handed the phone back to me. Then she turned toward the HOA president, who suddenly looked far less confident than she had moments earlier. The city official stated, clearly and without hesitation, that the permits were valid. She explained that the city had jurisdiction over the area being used and that the event was operating within approved guidelines. Her tone was professional, firm, and final. There was no room for interpretation, no loopholes, no ambiguity. The rules were real this time, and they weren't the ones the HOA president had invented. I watched the HOA president's posture change almost instantly. Her shoulders stiffened. Her jaw tightened. She tried to interrupt, insisting that HOA authority overrode city approval, but the city official stopped her mid-sentence. She explained patiently but firmly that an HOA could not override city-issued permits for lawful activities in public spaces. Every word felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Around us, the neighbors were watching closely. You could feel the shift happen in real time. The whispers changed tone. People who had been standing back started stepping closer. Volunteers who had looked uncertain a few minutes earlier relaxed. A couple of parents smiled, relief obvious on their faces. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about truth being acknowledged publicly. I felt something I hadn't felt since this started. Validation. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but a deep, steady reassurance that I hadn't imagined any of this. I wasn't being difficult. I wasn't reckless. I had followed the law, and now someone with real authority was saying so out loud, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. The HOA president tried one last angle, quietly suggesting that the event could still be considered a violation of community standards. The city official didn't even look back at her. Instead, she turned to me and asked if the HOA had attempted to interfere or threaten enforcement actions. I answered honestly. Fines, towing, police calls. As I spoke, I saw the HOA president's expression tighten further. That's when the city official's tone changed. She explained that interfering with a permitted event could carry consequences. She warned that continued obstruction, false reporting, or misuse of authority could lead to formal action. She didn't spell out every detail, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear, and it landed hard. The towing truck was instructed to leave. Slowly, almost awkwardly, it pulled away. The sight of it disappearing down the street felt surreal. A few volunteers exchanged quiet laughs of relief. The kids clutched their toys again, unaware of how close the whole thing had come to being shut down. As the city official finished speaking, she looked directly at the HOA president and told her that any further issues would be documented. The HOA president didn't respond. She just stood there, silent, as the power she had been wielding all morning evaporated in front of the entire neighborhood. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. But as the city official pulled me aside and told me to keep all records and communications, her serious expression told me something else was coming. This might have ended the confrontation, but it hadn't ended the consequences. What she thought was a complaint turned into an investigation against her. At first, I didn't even realize it was happening. The event continued, the crowd grew, and for a few hours it felt like we had finally crossed the finish line. But beneath the laughter, the music, and the donations piling up, something else was quietly taking shape. Something the HOA president hadn't anticipated. A few days after the event, my phone rang while I was at work. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced herself as a city compliance officer. She explained that because of the threats and attempted shutdown of a permitted event, the city was opening an inquiry into the HOA's actions. Hearing that stopped me in my tracks. This was no longer just a disagreement between neighbors. The city was officially involved. She asked detailed questions. Who contacted the police? Who threatened towing? Who claimed authority over the permits? I answered carefully, sticking to facts, and sent over the documentation I had saved. Emails, timestamps, photos, and notes from that morning. As I forwarded each file, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. All the things that had made me anxious now mattered. Every message I'd nearly deleted was suddenly evidence. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood. Neighbors started reaching out, asking what was happening and offering support. A couple of people admitted they'd been afraid to speak up earlier, but were glad someone finally stood their ground. Volunteers shared stories of their own run-ins with the HOA, things they'd brushed off as normal until now. The mood shifted from quiet frustration to open conversation. What struck me most was how quickly the HOA's authority started to feel smaller. Not officially yet, but socially. People questioned things they had always accepted without thought. Why were some rules enforced and others ignored? Why did certain residents seem untouchable? The questions weren't being asked out of anger anymore. They were being asked out of curiosity, and that can be far more dangerous to unchecked power. Emotionally, it felt like watching justice unfold in slow motion. There was no dramatic announcement, no public apology, just a steady unraveling of the narrative the HOA president had built around herself. The confidence she once projected was replaced by silence. She stopped sending emails. She stopped making public statements. That silence spoke volumes. Then one evening, an email landed in my inbox that made my heart start racing again. It was from the city, short and carefully worded. It confirmed the inquiry was ongoing and mentioned that additional concerns had surfaced during the review. It didn't specify what those concerns were, only that they went beyond the incident at the charity event. I reread that line several times, trying to process what it meant. This wasn't just about me anymore. Whatever the city had found, it suggested a pattern, not a one-time lapse in judgment. As I sat there staring at the screen, I realized the situation had crossed another invisible line. The event may have ended, but the fallout was just beginning, and it was heading straight for her. The event they tried so hard to kill ended up helping more families than I ever imagined. Once the tension lifted and the fear faded, something incredible happened. People showed up in waves. Cars lined the street. Donation bins filled faster than we could empty them. Toys stacked up higher than the tables. Coats, blankets, food boxes, everything we had hoped for, and then some. What started as a stressful standoff turned into one of the most meaningful days our neighborhood had ever seen. Parents thanked us quietly, some with tears in their eyes. Kids laughed as they clutched new toys, completely unaware of how close they'd come to leaving empty-handed. Volunteers moved with purpose, energized instead of nervous now, helping wherever they were needed. The atmosphere shifted into something warm and genuine, the kind of feeling that reminds you why community matters in the first place. Standing there, watching it all unfold, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not pride, but relief. Relief that we hadn't backed down. Relief that fear hadn't won. Neighbors who had stayed on the sidelines earlier stepped forward to help. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others admitted they'd been intimidated by the HOA for years and didn't think pushing back was even possible. That honesty brought people together in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time since moving there, the neighborhood felt unified, not divided by quiet rules and unspoken pressure. Behind the scenes, consequences were starting to take shape. The HOA president stopped appearing at community gatherings. Emails from her suddenly became carefully worded or disappeared altogether. I later learned that she had been instructed to limit communication while the city's inquiry continued. Board meetings were postponed. The confidence she once displayed so freely was gone, replaced by distance and silence. While nothing had been officially announced yet, it was clear that her actions had finally caught up with her. As the day wound down and the last donations were loaded up for delivery, I took a moment to step back and take it all in. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement where hours earlier a tow truck had waited. The contrast was striking. What was meant to be shut down had flourished instead. What was meant to intimidate had empowered people. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Emotionally, I felt changed. This wasn't just about one event or one conflict anymore. It was about learning that standing up calmly, legally, and firmly actually works. It was about understanding that authority only holds power when no one questions it. I thought about how close I had come to canceling everything, how easy it would have been to avoid conflict and walk away. That choice would have haunted me far longer than any fine ever could. But even in that moment of victory, something felt unfinished. A few days later, I noticed small things that didn't sit right. A delayed response to a routine HOA request, a sudden notice about reviewing community policies, whispers about new enforcement measures being discussed behind closed doors. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to make my instincts flare again. As grateful as I was for how things had turned out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't done. The event may have ended in unity and generosity, but power doesn't disappear quietly. And as I looked ahead, I had a sinking suspicion that this wasn't the last time they would come after me. What I learned terrified me. If they could try to cancel charity, they could target anyone. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, in the quiet moments after everything was over, when the decorations were packed away and the neighborhood looked normal again. On the surface, life went back to routine, but underneath, something fundamental had changed in how I saw power, rules, and the people trusted to enforce them. Before all this, I assumed that following the rules was enough, that if you stayed respectful, did your paperwork, and acted in good faith, things would work out. What this experience taught me is that rules don't protect you if someone is willing to bend or invent them. Knowledge does. Documentation does. Calm persistence does. If I had relied on assumptions instead of facts, fear instead of preparation, this story would have ended very differently. I learned to never take authority at face value. Titles don't equal truth. Confidence doesn't equal legality. Just because someone speaks loudly or threatens consequences doesn't mean they're right. If you're dealing with an HOA or any organization with power over your home, know your documents better than they do. Read your bylaws. Save every email. Get approvals in writing. Don't rely on verbal assurances or intimidation masked as procedure. I also learned how important it is to stay calm when someone wants you emotional. Every time I slowed my voice and stuck to facts, it weakened their position. Every time I documented instead of reacting, it shifted the balance. That doesn't mean it was easy. There were moments when fear felt overwhelming, when backing down seemed like the safest option. But safety isn't always found in silence. Sometimes it's found in standing still while someone else exposes themselves. What surprised me most was how many people quietly reached out afterward. Neighbors, friends, even strangers who heard about what happened. They shared stories of fines that didn't make sense, warnings that felt personal, rules that appeared out of nowhere. Stories they'd kept to themselves because they didn't think anyone would listen. That told me this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that survives on people feeling alone. If you're watching this and you've dealt with something similar, I want you to know this. You're not crazy and you're not powerless. You don't have to be aggressive or confrontational to defend yourself. You just have to be prepared and willing to stand your ground. And sometimes your refusal to fold is exactly what exposes a system that's been operating unchecked. As for me, I'd like to say this was the end, that everything settled down and the HOA learned its lesson. But I've lived here long enough to know that power rarely disappears. It just waits. Policies are being reviewed. Rules are being clarified. Enforcement is being discussed again. I can feel the tension rebuilding, quieter this time, more calculated. I'm not scared the way I was before. I'm alert. I'm ready. Because once you've seen how easily authority can be misused, you don't unsee it. You prepare for it, you document it, and you share your story so others know what's possible when someone finally pushes back. This started as a Christmas charity event. It turned into a lesson about rights, courage, and control. And while this chapter is ending, I know one thing for certain. The fight isn't over. Not for me, not for this neighborhood, and not for anyone who's ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, and comply.